The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rutted trail as Luke Carter guided his stagecoach through the winding mountain passes north of Durango. 20 years of driving these routes had etched every switchback and outcropping into his memory. But the spring thaws always brought fresh hazards. Loose rocks, mudslides, and desperate men pushed to violence by winter's hardships. His weathered hands gripped the reins loosely, letting the experienced team of 6 horses pick their way around the hairpin turns, while his eyes scanned the cliff faces towering above. Behind him, the passengers swayed and bumped along in uneasy silence. 3 miners headed for the new strike-up near Pueblo, a traveling salesman with his cases of patent medicines, and Eleanor Nelson, the new schoolteacher bound for the growing settlement of Thunder Creek. Luke had tried making conversation earlier, but the tension of the treacherous route had slowly strangled any attempts at pleasantries. Now there was only the creak of wood and leather, the rhythmic clop of hooves, and the occasional nervous gasp when the coach wheels slid too close to the precipitous drop-offs. A flash of movement caught Luke's eye. A splash of bright color against the dull browns and grays of the rocky slope. He squinted through the dust and saw a small figure in a red shirt scrambling among the boulders, followed by the heart-stopping sight of rocks beginning to tumble and slide. The boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, looked up in terror as the mountainside seemed to come alive above him. Without hesitation, Luke hauled back on the reins, bringing the stage to a jarring halt that sent his passengers sprawling. "Hold tight," he shouted, already leaping from the driver's box. His boots hit the ground running as he sprinted toward the child. The boy was frozen in place, watching death cascade toward him in a growing avalanche of stone. Luke's legs burned as he pushed himself faster, gauging angles and timing with the instincts of a man who'd spent his life in these mountains. He reached the child just as the first rocks thundered past, scooping him up and diving behind a massive boulder that stood like a sentinel against the slope. The world dissolved into chaos and thunder as Luke curled his body around the boy, protecting him from the stinging shrapnel of rock shards that filled the air. The ground shook beneath them as larger boulders crashed past their shelter, and Luke silently thanked whatever saints watched over fools and stagecoach drivers. When the rumbling finally subsided and the dust began to settle, he carefully uncurled and checked the trembling child for injuries. Dark eyes, in a tear-streaked face, stared back at him with a mixture of fear and wonder. "Thank the spirits," a deep voice called from above. Luke looked up to see a tall Apache warrior making his way down the slope with the sure-footed grace of a mountain sheep. 2 more followed behind him, their faces painted with intricate designs that marked them as members of a prominent band. The first man reached them and knelt beside the boy, speaking soft words in Apache while checking him over. Then he turned to Luke with grave dignity. "You have saved my grandson from joining his ancestors too soon. I am Joshua, chief of the Shadow Mountain people." The revelation hit Luke like a physical blow. He'd heard of Joshua, a legendary figure who'd managed to keep peace between his people and the settlers through a combination of wisdom, strength, and careful diplomacy. The man's grandson shouldn't have been playing alone in these mountains. Then Luke noticed the signs of pursuit in the warrior's gear and weapons. They'd been chasing the boy, probably after he'd slipped away from camp. The chief seemed to read his thoughts and smiled slightly. "Young talker to horses has his grandfather's stubborn spirit, but not yet his wisdom," Joshua said, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He thought to prove himself brave by traveling alone to the white man's town. Now he has learned that true bravery often lies in accepting help from others." The chief reached beneath his shirt and pulled out a turquoise amulet hanging from a leather cord. The stone was expertly worked into the shape of a shield, with delicate silver wire creating patterns across its face. Luke tried to decline the offered gift, but Joshua insisted. "This carries powerful medicine," the chief explained, placing the cord around Luke's neck. "It turns aside the bullets of those with evil in their hearts. More importantly, it marks you as a friend of my people." He glanced meaningfully at the other warriors, who nodded solemnly. "The Shadow Mountain Band remembers those who show kindness to our children. Go with our blessing, Luke Carter. We will meet again." Before Luke could respond, they melted away into the rocks with their young charge, leaving him alone with the amulet and 1,000 questions. His passengers were calling anxiously from the stage, and he knew he needed to get moving to make Thunder Creek by nightfall. But as he climbed back onto the driver's box and got the team moving again, His fingers kept straying to the smooth stone resting against his chest. He'd never put much stock in Indian medicine, but something told him his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, though Luke found himself studying the rocky outcrops with new awareness. Several times he caught glimpses of movement that might have been shadows, or might have been watching eyes. The amulet seemed to grow warmer against his skin as the sun sank toward the horizon, and he wondered what other secrets these mountains held. He'd driven this route for 2 decades, but suddenly he felt like a tenderfoot seeing it all for the first time. The first stars were appearing in the purple dusk when Luke finally guided the stage into Thunder Creek. The mining town's scattered lights winked between the pines, looking deceptively peaceful despite its reputation as one of the roughest settlements along the Durango route. As he drew closer, he could make out the silhouettes of ore carts abandoned along the tracks and smell the acrid tang of sulfur from the processing works. Something about the place felt different tonight, though he couldn't put his finger on what. Luke pulled the stage up to the station, his seasoned team of horses knowing the routine well enough to position themselves perfectly alongside the water trough. As he helped his passengers down, he noticed an unusual number of hard-looking men lounging around the station's porch, their eyes following his every move. The amulet seemed to pulse against his chest, as if sensing danger. Among the watchers, he recognized Nathan Cross, a former stage robber he'd helped put away 5 years ago. The man had sworn revenge, and Luke hadn't expected to see him out of Yuma prison so soon. Inside the station, the usual bustle of arriving passengers and freight handlers was subdued. Caroline, the station master's wife, gave Luke a worried look as she handed him his mail packet. "Those men have been hanging around since noon," she whispered, her eyes darting to the window. "Something's not right, Luke." Isaac saw them meeting with some of the miners up at Caleb's saloon, talking about a big silver shipment coming through. The mention of silver made Luke's stomach tighten. Tomorrow's stage would be carrying the monthly payroll for 3 mining camps north of Pueblo, along with a substantial bullion shipment. He'd been scheduled to drive it, but now the weight of the turquoise against his skin seemed like a warning. He remembered the Apache chief's words about protection, wondering if he was about to discover just how much truth they held. That night in his room above the livery, Luke cleaned his Colt with practiced care while considering his options. He could request a guard detail from the local sheriff, but Joshua Miller was deep in his cups more often than not these days. The railroad had pulled their armed escorts after budget cuts, leaving the stages vulnerable along the mountain routes. As he worked, moonlight filtered through his window, catching the amulet where it lay on his bedside table and making it seem to glow with an inner light. Just before dawn, Luke made his decision. He'd drive tomorrow's run as planned, but he'd take the old mining road through Apache Pass instead of the main trail. It was riskier terrain, but it would give him the advantage of high ground and narrow passages where ambushers would have trouble maneuvering. As he saddled up in the gray morning light, he caught a glimpse of movement on the ridge above town, a flash of feathers and the glint of morning sun on bronze skin that vanished so quickly he might have imagined it. The loading went smoothly enough, though Luke noticed Nathan and his men had disappeared from their posts around the station. Eleanor, a young widow heading to Durango with her 2 children, was his only passenger. The others had mysteriously canceled their bookings overnight. The strong box, heavy with silver and cash, was secured beneath his feet, and the spare rifle was loaded and within easy reach. As Luke guided the stage out of Thunder Creek, the amulet grew noticeably warmer, and he could have sworn he heard the cry of an eagle echo off the canyon walls, though the sky above was empty. The first few miles passed in tense silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves. The old mining road was rougher than he remembered, washing out in places where spring floods had torn away at the mountainside. Eleanor kept her children close, clearly sensing the unnatural quiet that had fallen over the wilderness. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to break the mounting tension that hung over the stage like an approaching storm. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mining town of Durango as Luke Carter guided his stagecoach through the narrow streets, his mind still dwelling on the strange events of the previous week. The turquoise amulet hung heavy around his neck, its smooth surface occasionally catching the light as he maneuvered between the weathered buildings. He'd been a different man then, a thief planning one last score before leaving his outlaw life behind. Nathan Hall, the owner of the Silver Peak mine, had hired Luke despite his questionable past, giving him a chance that few others would. The regular route between Durango and Pueblo Wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. Luke had convinced himself that driving the coach would provide perfect cover for scouting the mine's security, until fate intervened in the form of a young Apache boy and a cascade of tumbling rocks. The memory of that moment still made Luke's hands shake on the reins. He'd been taking a shortcut through Apache Pass when he heard the first rocks fall. Without thinking, he'd leapt from the coach and tackled the boy clear of the avalanche, the two of them rolling into a shallow cave as tons of stone thundered past. The boy, he later learned, was the grandson of Chief Running Fox. Isaac Lopez, Luke's partner in crime, hadn't taken the news of Luke's change of heart well. "You're soft," he'd spat, pacing their hideout in an abandoned mine shaft. "One good deed and suddenly you're too good for the score we've been planning for months?" But Luke couldn't shake the image of the chief's weathered face as he'd pressed the turquoise amulet into Luke's hands, speaking of protection and destiny. The coach rounded another bend, and Luke spotted a familiar figure on horseback, Caleb Allen, the mine's head of security. The man had been watching Luke like a hawk since his hiring, clearly suspicious of his past. Luke didn't blame him. After all, he'd been right about Luke's initial intentions. But now, with the weight of the amulet and his promise to leave his criminal past behind, Luke felt an unfamiliar desire to prove himself worthy of trust. As the coach approached the mine's storage yard, Luke noticed unusual movement among the shadows. His years of experience as an outlaw made him instantly alert to the signs. Men trying too hard to look casual, bulges of hidden weapons beneath coats. His heart sank as he recognized Isaac among them, realizing his former partner had decided to proceed with the heist with or without him. Charlotte Nelson, the mine's bookkeeper, was waiting at the yard's entrance with the weekly payroll strongbox. She'd always been kind to Luke, defending him when others questioned his presence. Now, watching her step forward with the heavy box, Luke felt the crushing weight of his choices bearing down. He had to decide in seconds: warn her and reveal his knowledge of the impending robbery, or stay silent and let his former crew proceed. The decision was made for him when Isaac stepped out, pistol drawn. "Just like we planned, Luke," he called out with a cruel smile. "Only now you get to play the hero instead of the inside man." Luke's hand instinctively went to the turquoise amulet as he positioned himself between Charlotte and the gang, praying the chief's words about protection weren't just a pleasant fiction. From the corner of his eye, Luke caught a flash of movement in the rocks above the yard. Subtle shifts that most would mistake for shadow and wind. But he'd spent enough time in Apache territory to recognize the signs of warriors moving into position. The amulet seemed to grow warm against his chest as he realized he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring as Isaac's men spread out around the coach. Luke could feel Charlotte trembling behind him, could hear Caleb Allen slowly drawing his weapon. The late afternoon light painted everything in shades of gold and shadow, and somewhere in the distance, a lone hawk screamed. The moment of truth had arrived, and Luke Carter, reformed outlaw, was about to discover exactly what kind of protection an Apache amulet could provide. Isaac's men made their first move, Joshua stepping forward with his revolver trained on Luke's chest. "That's a mighty fine piece of Indian jewelry you're wearing there," he sneered, gesturing to the amulet with his gun barrel. "Hand it over along with whatever's in that strongbox, and maybe we all walk away from this." The afternoon wind carried the scent of sage and dust, mixing with the metallic tang of fear that seemed to hang in the air. Luke's mind raced through his options, remembering his own days riding with outlaws. He knew their patterns, their weaknesses, how they'd expect resistance from the front while sending men to flank their target. Sure enough, he caught the subtle crunch of boots on gravel as two more of Isaac's gang tried circling behind the coach. What they didn't know was that somewhere up in those sun-baked cliffs, Apache warriors were watching their every move. "You boys picked the wrong day to try this," Luke called out, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. He could feel Charlotte's presence behind him, her breath coming in quick, frightened gasps. Caleb had managed to position himself near the coach's rear wheel, his hand hovering near his holster. The old man might have been pushing 60, but Luke had seen him outshoot men half his age. The shadows lengthened across the yard as clouds drifted over the late afternoon sun, casting everything in an eerie twilight. The mining equipment scattered around the yard, ore carts, timber supports, and rusted machinery, created a maze of potential cover. Luke knew that both sides would be looking to use it to their advantage once the shooting started. The question was, who would make the first move? "Last chance, Carter," Isaac himself emerged from behind an abandoned ore cart, his duster coat catching the wind. I know you're trying to go straight, play the honest man. But some of us remember when you rode with Nathan's gang up near Durango. You really want to die protecting some rich folks' gold? There was a dangerous glint in his eye that Luke recognized all too well, the look of a man who'd already decided how this would end. The amulet seemed to pulse against Luke's chest, and he caught another flicker of movement in the rocks. Closer now. The Apache warriors were positioning themselves with the patience of hunters who'd chosen their moment. Luke allowed himself a small smile, remembering the chief's words about protection coming in unexpected forms. He just needed to keep the gang distracted for a few moments longer. "You're right about one thing, Isaac," Luke replied, slowly raising his hands in what appeared to be surrender. "I do remember those days with Nathan's gang. Remember how it ended too, with most of them dead or in prison because they got careless, because they thought they had everything figured out." His fingers brushed against the amulet, and he swore he could feel it vibrate with energy. The tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Joshua's trigger finger tightened, Isaac's men continued their careful advance, and somewhere up in the rocks, Luke knew arrows were being drawn. The next few seconds would determine whether the amulet's protection was genuine or if he'd staked everything on a piece of pretty turquoise and an old man's stories. A pebble clattered down from the cliffs, drawing everyone's attention upward for just a fraction of a second. In that moment, Luke saw what the gang couldn't: the silent shapes moving into position, bowstrings pulling taut. The amulet grew warm against his skin, and he knew with sudden certainty that the chief's grandson hadn't been the only one he'd saved that day in the rockslide. He'd earned the respect and protection of an entire people without realizing it. "I'm giving you one last chance," Luke announced, his voice carrying across the yard with newfound authority. "Ride away now, and we'll call it even. Stay, and you'll learn what real protection looks like." The sun broke through the clouds again, catching the turquoise amulet and making it shine like a beacon. Above them, the hawk screamed once more, but this time it sounded almost like a signal. The gang leader, Nathan, shifted uneasily in his saddle, his weathered face betraying a flicker of uncertainty as he studied Luke's confident stance. The other outlaws exchanged nervous glances, their horses pawing at the dusty ground outside the Pueblo mining office. Something in Luke's demeanor had changed. There was a steadiness about him that hadn't been there moments before, and it made them wary. "You're bluffing, Stagecoach man," Nathan called out, but his voice lacked its earlier menace. His eyes darted between the rocky outcroppings above them, searching for whatever had caused that loose pebble to fall. The late afternoon shadows were growing longer, creating deep pockets of darkness where anything, or anyone, could be hiding. Luke's hand rested casually on his holster, the turquoise amulet catching the fading sunlight. He could feel the presence of the Apache warriors in the growing darkness, silent and deadly as mountain lions. The knowledge gave him a calm he'd never experienced during previous confrontations. "The gold shipment isn't worth dying for, Nathan. You've got a chance to walk away. I suggest you take it." Behind him, through the mining office's grimy window, Luke could see Eleanor hurriedly moving the strongbox into the back room. The young widow had taken over as office manager after her husband's death in a cave-in, and she'd shown more grit than most men Luke knew. He'd promised to protect the weekly shipment, and he intended to keep that promise. A soft whisper of wind brought the scent of sage and pine down from the mountains, and with it came another sound, the barely perceptible creak of bowstrings being drawn. Nathan's right-hand man, Isaac, suddenly straightened in his saddle, his face going pale. "Nathan," he hissed, "there's something up there in them rocks. We should—" Before he could finish, an arrow thudded into the ground between his horse's front hooves. The animal reared, nearly unseating Isaac, and chaos erupted. Luke Carter gripped the reins tighter as his stagecoach rounded the steep mountain pass leading to the Pueblo mining camp. The turquoise amulet hanging from his neck caught the late afternoon sun, its polished surface a constant reminder of the debt he owed the Apache people. 3 weeks had passed since he'd saved young running deer from certain death in that rockslide, and the mysterious gift from the boy's grandfather still made him uneasy. The old chief's words echoed in his mind. Protection comes in many forms, some seen, some unseen. The winding trail hugged the cliffside, barely wide enough for the coach wheels in places. His passengers, Nathan Hall, a claims assessor from Tucson, and Caroline Lopez, a young widow headed to meet family, had fallen silent as the path grew more treacherous. Luke had made this run dozens of times, but something felt different today. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he caught movement in the scrub oak above the trail. A rifle shot cracked through the mountain air, sending birds scattering from the twisted pines. Luke yanked the reins hard, bringing the coach to a sudden halt that nearly pitched Nathan from his perch beside him. 3 riders emerged from behind a granite outcropping ahead, bandanas pulled up over their faces. Luke recognized the lead man's mount, a distinctive blue roan stallion belonging to Isaac Allen, a former guard at the Pueblo silver mine who'd turned to robbery after being fired for theft. "Step down nice and easy," Isaac called out, his rifle trained on Luke's chest. "You know the drill, Carter. Mail pouch and strong box first, then whatever valuables the passengers are carrying." Luke's hand instinctively went to the amulet as he slowly descended from the driver's seat. Caroline's soft weeping from inside the coach made his jaw clench. He'd promised safe passage, and he meant to deliver on that promise, one way or another. The familiar weight of his Colt pressed against his ribs, hidden beneath his coat. Luke knew he could probably draw and get off a shot, but Isaac's 2 companions had them well covered from different angles. The old Luke Carter would have already been reaching for his gun. Consequences be damned. But the weight of the turquoise against his chest reminded him that sometimes protection came from unexpected sources. As Luke reached for the strongbox, movement caught his eye. Silent shapes moving through the rocks above. The afternoon shadows seemed to shift and flow of their own accord. Isaac and his men were too focused on their prey to notice the deadly grace of the Apache warriors positioning themselves on the surrounding ridges. Luke allowed himself a small smile as he remembered the chief's words about unseen protection. "That's far enough," a new voice rang out. Joshua Nelson, the lead mine guard Luke had been scheduled to meet at the next waypoint, appeared from around the bend with 3 armed men. Isaac's gang wheeled their horses, only to freeze at the sight of a dozen Apache warriors materializing from the rocks above, arrows nocked and ready. The old Luke Carter would have reached for his gun in that moment. The new Luke Carter simply waited, watching justice unfold. The fight was brief but fierce. Isaac tried to shoot his way clear but found his path blocked by Joshua's men below and the Apache above. His companions surrendered quickly, but Isaac made a final, desperate attempt to escape up a narrow draw. He didn't make it far before an Apache arrow found its mark, sending him tumbling from his saddle. The blue roan stallion bolted past Luke, disappearing down the trail toward Pueblo. When the dust settled, Caroline emerged from the coach, tears of relief streaming down her face. Nathan Hall looked shaken but managed a weak smile. Joshua and his men began securing the prisoners while the Apache warriors melted back into the landscape as silently as they'd appeared. Luke touched the turquoise amulet, finally understanding. The old chief hadn't given him protection against bullets. He'd given him something far more valuable: allies who watched from the shadows and a reason to choose a better path. The rest of the journey to Pueblo passed without incident, though Luke caught occasional glimpses of movement in the rocks above. The Apache were still there, still watching, still protecting. When they reached town, Caroline squeezed his hand in gratitude before departing to meet her waiting family. Joshua Nelson offered him a deputy's position on the spot, impressed by his cool head during the robbery attempt. Luke declined politely, knowing his path now lay elsewhere. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Luke sat alone in the Pueblo Saloon, turning the turquoise amulet in his fingers. His old life as a gun for hire seemed distant now, replaced by something deeper. He'd found his own kind of redemption in that moment of choice on the mountain, not through violence, but through trust in the unseen hands that guided him. Tomorrow he would return to his route, knowing that somewhere in the rocky heights, watchful eyes would continue to guard his path. The next morning, Luke found himself unable to leave Pueblo as planned. Something about Joshua Nelson's offer nagged at him, like a burr caught under a saddle. He'd spent so many years running from responsibility, taking the easy money as a hired gun, that the thought of putting down roots terrified him more than any shootout. But as he watched the townsfolk going about their morning business from the hotel's wooden porch, he noticed how they greeted each other with ease familiarity, something his wandering life had never allowed. The decision was made for him when a breathless young miner burst into town, his face streaked with coal dust and fear. Isaac Bennett's mine had collapsed, trapping 24 men inside. Without hesitation, Luke mounted up, the turquoise amulet bouncing against his chest as he rode hard behind Joshua's posse toward the mountainside operation. The mine entrance gaped like an open wound in the rocky face. Timber supports splintered and broken. As they organized rescue efforts, Luke caught movement in his peripheral vision. Familiar shapes moving through the scrub brush. The Apache had followed him here too. Their presence gave him an idea. He approached Joshua, explaining how the tribal warriors knew these mountains better than anyone, including the hidden caves and passages that honeycombed the range. The sheriff's initial skepticism faded when Luke revealed the amulet and told the full story of his encounter with the chief's grandson. Working together, the Apache guides led them to a narrow fissure half a mile from the main collapse. Luke and 3 warriors squeezed through the tight passage, their way lit only by guttering lanterns. The air grew thick and stale as they descended, but eventually they heard faint voices echoing through the rock. The trapped miners had found a pocket of relative safety, though their air was running out. The rescue operation took hours of backbreaking work, passing tools and timber through the cramped tunnel to shore up unstable sections. Luke's shoulders burned and his lungs ached from the dust, but he thought of Caroline's words about choosing a better path. This was it, not glory or gold, but the simple act of helping others. When the last miner emerged into the sunlight, the look of gratitude in their coal-smudged faces made every moment worth it. That evening, as the celebration in Pueblo's saloon reached its peak, Joshua pulled Luke aside. The sheriff's offer still stood, but with a twist. He wanted Luke to serve as a liaison between the town and the Apache tribe, building trust between 2 peoples who had long viewed each other with suspicion. The turquoise amulet around Luke's neck seemed to warm at the suggestion, as if approving this new direction. Luke found himself thinking of all the miles he'd covered on the stagecoach routes, always moving but never arriving anywhere that felt like home. Perhaps home wasn't a place at all, but a purpose. He looked around the crowded saloon, at the miners he'd helped save, at Joshua's steady gaze, at the Apache warriors who had joined the celebration at his invitation. The walls between their worlds were starting to crumble, like the barriers he'd built around his own heart. As the night deepened, Luke stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The stars wheeled overhead, unchanged since his gunslinger days, but he was different now. The amulet's real power, he realized, wasn't in stopping bullets. It was in stopping him long enough to see the truth about himself. He'd spent years building a reputation with his gun, but his legacy would be built with his hands and heart, helping to forge connections between people who had forgotten they were all under the same sky. Tomorrow, he would begin his new role, not as a man running from his past, but as someone building toward a future. The mountain paths that had once seemed like escape routes now felt like connections, weaving together the disparate threads of his life into something meaningful. The Apache had shown him that protection came not from weapons or talismans, but from the bonds forged between people who chose to trust one another. The first rays of dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber when Luke heard the distant thunder of hooves. His hand instinctively moved to his holster, but the turquoise amulet caught the morning light, reminding him of his new path. Through the morning mist, he could make out 3 riders approaching the stagecoach station, their intentions clear from the bandanas pulled up over their faces. The station's other occupants were still asleep, leaving Luke alone to face what was coming. He stepped into the shadow of the wooden porch, the weathered boards creaking beneath his boots. The lead rider, a man Luke recognized as Isaac Moore, a notorious outlaw he'd once ridden with, reined his horse to a stop in a cloud of dust. "Well, if it ain't the famous Luke Thompson," Isaac called out, his voice carrying the edge of old grievances. "Heard you've gone soft, running mail and passengers instead of banks." The other 2 riders spread out, their rifles trained on the station's windows. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Durango as Luke Carter stood before the weathered doors of the Miners' Bank, his heart pounding beneath the turquoise amulet. The weight of his past choices pressed down on him like the mountain peaks looming above the town. He knew the Lopez gang would arrive within the hour, expecting him to unlock the back door and help them rob his own workplace, the final test of loyalty they'd demanded when he'd tried to leave their outfit. Behind the bank counter, Eleanor Hall sorted through the morning's deposits, unaware that her new teller was wrestling with a decision that would shape both their fates. Luke had taken the job 3 months ago, hoping to build an honest life, but his former companions hadn't let him go so easily. The amulet seemed to pulse against his chest, reminding him of the debt he owed to the Apache people who had saved him from that rockslide. In the shadows of the surrounding peaks, Joshua, the young Apache warrior who had been watching Luke since the amulet was bestowed, signaled to his companions. They had witnessed Luke's struggle to reform, seen him help widows with their banking needs, teach local children to read during his lunch breaks. The grandson of their chief had insisted they protect this white man who had proven his worth, though they remained uncertain if he would make the right choice when tested. The Lopez gang's scout, Nathan Lopez himself, watched from the saloon across the street, his cold eyes fixed on the bank's entrance. He had no idea that Luke's apparent cooperation these past weeks had been a carefully orchestrated deception, buying time while Luke worked with Isaac Nelson, the town marshal, to set a trap. The marshal's deputies were already positioned in the boarding houses flanking the bank, waiting. Caroline Carter, Luke's sister who ran the town's general store, crossed the street with her daily deposit, catching Luke's eye through the bank window. She alone knew the full weight of his redemption journey, had watched him fight his demons and struggle to build something honest. The slight nod she gave him carried years of shared pain and hope, strengthening his resolve for what was to come. As the town clock struck 9, Caleb Lopez and his remaining 3 riders appeared at the end of the street, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of reddish dust. Luke's hand moved to the amulet, drawing comfort from its smooth surface as he prepared to spring the trap. Eleanor, now wise to the plan, calmly began moving the elderly customers toward the bank's reinforced back room. The Apache warriors silently took up positions on the rooftops, their presence unknown to both the gang and the marshal's men. Joshua nocked an arrow, its obsidian tip glinting in the morning sun. They had no intention of revealing themselves unless absolutely necessary, honoring their chief's command to let Luke prove himself worthy of the amulet's protection. The confrontation erupted like a summer storm in the mountains. Caleb Lopez burst through the doors, guns drawn, only to find Luke standing resolute behind the counter, badge pinned to his vest, the turquoise amulet gleaming. The gang leader's face twisted with rage at the betrayal, but before he could pull the trigger, Marshal Nelson's voice boomed from the street, demanding surrender. What followed was chaos orchestrated into justice. As the Lopez gang attempted to shoot their way to freedom, the marshal's deputies emerged from their hiding places. Luke dove across the counter, shielding Eleanor from stray bullets. The amulet seemed to burn against his skin, and above the gunfire he heard the whisper of bowstrings. Apache arrows pinned 2 outlaws to the wall with lethal precision, while others found their marks in gun hands and shoulders. Caleb Lopez, in a final desperate move, took aim at Luke's heart. The bullet seemed to curve impossibly around him as Joshua's arrow took the outlaw in the chest. The gang leader's last expression was one of disbelief as he stared at the turquoise amulet, never understanding that its true power lay not in mystical protection, but in the honor it represented and the allies it had earned. In the aftermath, as Marshal Nelson led the surviving gang members to jail, Joshua and his warriors melted away into the mountain shadows, their debt to Luke repaid. Eleanor emerged from behind the counter, her hands steady as she helped Luke tend to a graze on his arm. Caroline rushed in from her store, tears of relief streaming down her face as she embraced her brother. The town of Durango buzzed with the story for weeks. How Luke Carter, the reformed outlaw, had helped bring down the notorious Lopez gang. Few knew the full truth of the Apache warriors' involvement, and Luke kept their secret, understanding that some debts can only be repaid through honor and trust. The amulet remained against his chest, no longer a talisman of protection, but a reminder of the day he had finally become the man he had always hoped to be. As summer faded into autumn, Luke continued his work at the bank, now as its respected head teller. Eleanor had become more than a colleague, their shared experience forging a deeper bond. On quiet evenings, he would sometimes catch glimpses of shadows moving along the mountain ridges, and smile, knowing that his guardians remained, not because of obligation, but because they had chosen to call him friend. As winter descended on Durango, Luke found himself drawn more frequently to the mountain trails where he'd first encountered the Apache warriors. The turquoise amulet had become a constant companion, its smooth surface worn from his thoughtful touches during quiet moments at the bank. Eleanor noticed how he would often pause by the window, gazing toward the distant peaks where thin wisps of smoke sometimes rose from hidden camps. One crisp morning, a letter arrived from Tucson bearing news that would change everything. The Lopez gang's remaining members had escaped custody, and rumors suggested they were heading north for revenge. Luke shared the news with Eleanor over coffee at Caroline's store, his hand instinctively reaching for the amulet as he considered the implications. Eleanor's steady gaze met his, and he saw in her eyes the same determination that had helped them survive the robbery. The town council convened an emergency meeting, with Luke reluctantly accepting the role of deputy marshal. His past experience with outlaws, combined with his recent heroics, made him the logical choice. Caroline opposed the decision, fearing for her brother's safety, but Luke knew he had to face this final challenge to truly leave his old life behind. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar blanket. As preparations were made to defend the town, Luke received an unexpected visit from the Apache chief's grandson, now a young man who carried himself with quiet dignity. Through broken English and gesture, he conveyed that his people had observed the Lopez gang's movement through their territories. The warriors who had protected Luke would stand with Durango, not for the town's sake, but for the man who had earned their respect. Eleanor worked tirelessly beside Luke, organizing the townspeople and establishing a network of lookouts. Their hands would brush occasionally as they pored over maps, and in those moments the air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities. Caroline watched their growing closeness with knowing eyes, remembering how their father had always said love blooms strongest in times of trouble. The first snow fell as news arrived that the Lopez gang had been spotted in Pueblo. Luke spent long hours patrolling the mountain passes, often accompanied by silent Apache shadows that materialized and vanished like mountain mist. Eleanor insisted on riding with him some days, her skill with a rifle matching his own. During these patrols, they shared stories of their pasts, dreams of their futures, and the gradual realization that those futures might be intertwined. When the confrontation finally came, it was not the bloody battle everyone had feared. The Lopez gang, weakened by winter travel and harried by unseen Apache warriors, found themselves surrounded in a narrow canyon. Luke stood at the canyon's mouth, the turquoise amulet gleaming against his chest, as he offered them the same choice he'd been given months before: surrender and a chance at redemption. 3 of the gang members laid down their weapons, recognizing in Luke's eyes the truth of his words. The 4th, consumed by vengeance, raised his gun. Before he could fire, an Apache arrow found its mark, and the echo of the falling weapon rang through the canyon like the closing of a chapter. In the aftermath, as spring began to soften the mountain slopes, Luke and Eleanor were married beneath the same cottonwood tree where he had once taken shelter during his first days in Durango. The Apache chief's grandson attended, presenting them with matching turquoise pieces that symbolized not protection from bullets, but the enduring bonds of trust and honor. Caroline transformed her store into a gathering place for both townspeople and peaceful Apache traders, bridging cultures that had long stood apart. Luke continued his work at the bank, but also served as an unofficial liaison between Durango and the Apache people, using his unique position to foster understanding and cooperation. Years later, travelers passing through Durango would hear stories of the outlaw-turned-banker who wore a turquoise amulet and commanded the respect of both settlers and natives. But only those closest to Luke knew the full truth, that his greatest protection had never been the stone against his chest, but the love of a good woman and the loyalty of friends who moved like shadows through the mountain mist. The amulet remained a cherished symbol, passed down through generations of Carter children, who grew up hearing tales of honor, redemption, and the invisible guardians who watched over their family from the mountain ridges. And on quiet nights, when the moon cast long shadows across Durango's streets, some swore they could still see figures moving along the peaks, keeping their eternal vigil over the town and the man who had earned their trust.